I'd like to follow along with the scripture reading this morning. It'll come from Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 11 through 20. So I came to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. And I arose in the night, and I and some few men with me, neither told I any man what God had put in my heart to do at Jerusalem. Neither was there any beast with me, save the beast that I rode upon. And I went out by night by the gate of the valley, even before the dragon well, and to the dung port, and viewed the walls of Jerusalem, which were broken down, and the gates thereof were consumed with fire. Then I went to the gate of the fountain, and to the king's pool, but there was no place for the beast that was under me to pass. Then I went up to the night by the brook, and viewed the wall, and turned back, and entered by the gate of the valley, and so returned. And the rulers knew not whither I went, or what I did, neither had I as yet told to the Jews, nor to the priests, nor to the nobles, nor to the rulers, nor to the rest that did the work. Then I said unto them, Ye see the distress that we are in, how Jerusalem lieth waste, and the gates thereof are burned with fire. Come, and let us build up the wall of Jerusalem, that will be no more reproach. Then I told them of the hand of my God, which was good upon me, as also the king's word that he had spoken unto me. And they said, Let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for this good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite, and Tobiah the servant, the Ammonite, and Geshem the Arabian heard it, they laughed us to scorn, and despised us, and said, What is this thing that ye do? Will ye rebel against the king? Then answered I unto them, and said, The God of heaven, he will prosper us. Therefore we his servants will rise and build, but ye have no portion here, nor right, nor memorial in Jerusalem.
Good morning. Back in 2012, I spent several months in the country of Afghanistan. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to see a number of buildings that had been hit by bombs, have been destroyed by various attackers. The Russians, by the Taliban, by other groups that had attacked those buildings. Buildings that formerly had been palaces for the king of Afghanistan, government buildings, and homes. One building I remember especially had been the Queen's Palace. And it obviously had once been a magnificent edifice that would have impressed visitors with its splendor and magnificence. But now it was an empty shell of a building with its roof almost completely gone. And even from the bottom of the hill looking up at it, one could see that it was a mere shadow of what it had once been. As a lover of history, that shook me. But I also learned more about what it would mean when I talked to a woman about my age who, as a child, had belonged to a prominent family in Afghanistan, who had visited buildings like that one when they were still vibrant and beautiful. When instead of barren ground around them, there had been beautiful lawns, manicured lawns, and lots of flowers and trees. And as she talked about what had happened to her country in the last 40 years, she cried. And when I think about seeing her face and hearing her words, as she reflected on the ruin of her country, I think about how Nehemiah must have felt when he heard that although the exiles had returned to Jerusalem from captivity in Babylon, that the walls were still in ruins, that buildings were not being reconstructed, that people were depressed and moaning, complaining. And Nehemiah wept, as did that Afghan woman. But Nehemiah also prayed. And as we know, the last 2 weeks, his prayer and his fasting resulted in their forming in his mind a plan, a vision for the reconstruction not only of the beautiful buildings and the walls around Jerusalem, but also the rebuilding of a people, the people of God. There may be times in our lives when we reflect back on days where from our perspective, things were brighter, things were fuller. Some of you may look at a pew here that's now empty and say, think of someone that used to sit there. Or you may have a memory of a little church building that you attended when you were a child, that today exists no longer because the congregation there has moved to another location, or in some cases has ceased to exist. But Nehemiah had a vision for the rebuilding of the people and the rebuilding of the wall. A wall that would not only stand tall, but also would provide a sense of security and a sense of protection for the people who lived within. And of course, as he rebuilt the wall, he had to rekindle a vision. He had to rebuild for God. Back in 1961, there was a woman named Kathleen Kenyon who was an archaeologist who went to Jerusalem and started digging in a certain place. And as she dug, she found a place where a wall had been destroyed and refuse had been left. And as she pondered what the artifacts that were around the ruins of that wall, she realized that the ruins of that wall, the ruins that were there, the rubble, in the artifacts that were within it indicated that it went back to at least 600 years before Christ. But near that rubble there was a wall. A wall that still stood and that there's a picture of on the screen, which you may or may not be able to see depending on where you're sitting. And in the area around that wall, they were able to date to around 445 BC. 445 years approximately before the birth of Christ. The time in which Nehemiah lived. She was looking at Nehemiah's wall. The wall that he went back to rebuild. But at the beginning of our passage today that we're looking at, that wall wasn't there. It was still just the rubble. And the people who were living there had a picture in their minds that would not go away. The people who had been there, older people, remembered a secure wall, a strong wall that had protected them as children. And now all they saw was rocks on the ground. Their children and their grandchildren saw only the ruins. And that was their vision of how things were and how they ought to be. This was where Nehemiah returned. In our lesson, we'll look at some questions that Nehemiah must have pondered. And that we must ponder if we're going to build for God. If we're going to build a vision. If we're going to build a people. A congregation. If we're going to build a place where people worship God and praise God together with a sense of enthusiasm. Question, how do we begin to rebuild? How do we analyze the needs that exist and build and respond to them? Are there variables out there that can stop the rebuilding before it begins? And if there are obstacles, if there are opponents, how can we overcome them? As Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem, having obtained permission from the king of Persia to rebuild the city walls around Jerusalem, having gained from the king requisitions from the keepers of the royal forest that he could obtain lumber and supplies that he needed for building, having gained political permission to rebuild a wall around a city, a wall of security, a wall of strength, around a city that had a long, well-earned reputation for being a city that was independent and a bit rebellious. Nehemiah paused for 3 days when he arrived in Jerusalem. Now, what might Nehemiah have done? Nehemiah might have walked in and said, "Hello, I'm here from the government and I'm here to help." He could have shown his official papers from the king of Persia and said, "You all have messed this up and I'm here to straighten it up and rebuild this wall, and you just sit back and watch. It's going to be a beautiful thing." But that's not what Nehemiah did. That's not what Nehemiah did. It says in verse 11, he went to Jerusalem and he was there 3 days, and it doesn't say a thing about what he did. I suspect, having been on some rather long journeys like that, and some of the soldiers who have had long deployments might have empathized with this, that he needed a day or two just to recover. Not only his own to rest himself, but to make sure his horses and his people were cared for, that they were settled into places where they could sleep, that they had things to eat. But he also, I suspect, spent those 3 days just observing, listening to people, watching, and looking at what was left of a once magnificent city that had been made so beautiful by Solomon and the kings who reigned after him. He would have reviewed the news he had heard from his brother about the horrible state of the city and compared it to what he saw. And perhaps he gulped deeply and thought, what have I got myself into? When he saw how devastated the city truly was. And he began to plan. And as he began to execute the plan, he arose one night. And he makes the note here that he had not come in and told everybody what he was there to do. He had not shared yet his vision for Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the wall. So he goes out with a few men who are on foot, and he is riding on a horse. and they begin to go around the city. He goes by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and he inspects the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down. The gates that had been destroyed by fire. And then he goes back after looking at all this. Even at one point having to get off his mount, off his horse, and walk by foot because the horse could not get through a certain section. The devastation was so great. He returns back. And as he goes, he surveys and he analyzes, and he sees the ruins. He surveys the situation. He identifies the extent of the damage, and it's great. But he's also looking at rocks. And he's seeing rocks that can be used. And he's seeing some that are just so pulverized they're useless. He's inspecting beams, things that may be salvaged, that can be used to help rebuild. And perhaps he's watching the faces of those who are with him, considering what are they seeing as they look at this. And then he returns. And he tells the people what he's going to do. But first he has to consider what can stop his vision in his tracks. There may be people out there that don't want this wall to be built, and we're going to discover there were people that did not want the wall to be rebuilt. There were people outside the city, in countries around about, that did not want this city to become a bastion of strength again. There also were people within the city, within the people of Jerusalem, that were quite happy with things the way they were. Did not want to change. Another thing that could have stopped was a problem that Nehemiah did not have, though others might have. Nehemiah had counted the cost. He had already begun, even before he left Persia, to reckon in his mind what kind of materials might be needed, the extent of financial support he would need from the government, and how much people work he would need to do this task. But there were things that could halt the work too, that stand in the path of any rebuilding of a group of people. There were some people who, when they had come back from Babylon and from Persia, had begun to clean up, just so they could get around. And as they rebuilt meager buildings for themselves to live in and for their flocks to live in, a lot of them had just looked at the city and their shoulders had slumped because the job was so great. And they had given up. And they had gone out into the countryside and built a house there. Others had stayed and begun to clean up, but they had gotten not only physically but emotionally worn because of the extent of the task. And as we'll see in future chapters, there were people there who were also suffering not only from emotional fatigue, but from moral injury. They had become involved in situations and in relationships, both personal and political, that made it very, very hard for them to worship God. That made it very hard for them to serve God. That made it difficult for them to wish for the success of God's people as a group. Because that's not where they were anymore. They had ventured down another path, and their consciences, as the New Testament says, had been seared. Nehemiah had a lot of obstacles. He had a city in ruins, a discouraged people, and determined political opponents. But sometimes the mere fact that you have obstacles is something that's in your favor. Because you know what has to be done, you know the greatness of the task, and you know it's going to take some energy, it's going to take determination, and so you say, okay, how am I going to get around this? Because each of us in our lives encounter situations and times where it looks like we will not be able to go forward. Where relationships on which we had counted, in which we have poured our lives, have disintegrated. People whom we have trusted have betrayed us. We're injured as surely as if our arm were broken. It's hard to move forward. But we see the obstacles. But we also see a way to get around the obstacles. And we realize sometimes that the only way I'm going to get past that wall, get past that obstacle, is to have someone to help me. Because I cannot do it alone. Nehemiah definitely had a work in front of him that he could not do alone. He needed help, and he needed a lot of help. And as Nehemiah looked at the situation, he realized that while he came in with a group of soldiers and a group that had traveled with him, this group was not sufficient to accomplish the task. And he realized that as he looked around him, that a lot of the people who help he needed were hurting. And it would take a re-energizing of these people, a reawakening of a vision in them for them to succeed. So he spoke to them and he said, you see the trouble we're in. He acknowledged that there was difficulty. He acknowledged that there was a problem. Yes, the walls were in ruins. Yes, the gates were burned. But he said, come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem so that we may no longer suffer derision. Nehemiah said, do you realize that our neighbors out in the provinces around us are laughing at us? And this laughter has hurt you. This laughter has to stop. We've got to rebuild so that we may no longer suffer the derision. We can get rid of one of the things that's holding us back. And I told him, Nehemiah said, of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, how God had blessed him. And also at the words that the king had spoken to him. Nehemiah wasn't just there by himself. He wasn't trying to start a revolution. Nehemiah was there with permission to do this from the king. And he had some financial backing too. So he said, let's build. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work. And they began to buy into what he was saying. They began to see that there was hope. There was a path forward. There was where it had seemed there would not be. There was a door that was opening through which they could walk. They were not condemned to be turned from a people that lived as a military power in a city turned into hunter-gatherers. They strengthened their hands for the good work. But what happens when you start a good work? Sometimes you wake up your opponents. And that's exactly what happens here to Nehemiah. When Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" And you look at these people. Sanballat, there are actually archaeological stones that have been discovered that have this name as a governor of an adjoining province. Tobiah, the Ammonite servant. Interesting thing about that, though, Ammon's a province to the east of Judah, a historic enemy of Israel, but Tobiah is a Jewish name. This is the man that's gone over to the enemy. And Geshem the Arab, another name that's attested by archaeologists as having been a powerful figure politically in an adjoining area. And they look at what he's doing, and a little bit of fear arises in their hearts. They have rejoiced at the destruction of Israel. It's one less enemy they needed to worry about, but now there's someone that's reawakening the people that are in their midst. And so they say, what's this you're trying to do? Are you rebelling? Are you trying to do something wrong? And they begin to act against him. And their opposition could have engendered, and I'm sure did engender in Nehemiah, the people that were working with him, a sense of fear at what was happening. And when you think about fear, there are two acronyms that can come out of fear. And one is, forget everything and run. Nehemiah could have got their messages from these three adjoining provinces. He could have seen the discouragement of the people. He could have seen the enormity of the task. He could have thought, what am I doing here? There's no way I'm going to get this done. I'm just going to go back to Persia and enjoy being the king's right-hand man. It's not my problem these people are suffering. I've got a good life back in the capital. Or fear can awaken a sense in which you face everything and you rise to the moment. And that's what Nehemiah did. And that's what God calls us to do in moments when we face great obstacles in our lives and as a group, as a congregation of God's people. Is to face everything and rise. Because as Paul wrote to the Romans in Romans chapter 8, verse 31, if God be for us, who can be against us? But the choice, when it matters, either one of these acronyms is an accurate acronym. Fear can mean forget everything and run. It can mean face everything and rise. But whose choice is it? It's not like someone says you have to do it this way and you have no other choice. You have a choice on how you respond to the fear. Because fear can arise. I will tell you as a teenager, living in the age of door knocking, I was petrified at the idea of going up to some stranger's house and knocking on a door and saying, I'm from the Church of Christ and I want to invite you to our services. And would you be interested in a Bible study? It just scared me to death. It would have been... I could have chosen, like some of my friends do, not to go Actually, I could not have chosen. My dad was the preacher, and he wouldn't have let me choose that. But, I could face everything and rise. Sometimes we have to rise to the occasion. And sometimes, like my dad, we have to be the person who helps other people rise to the occasion. That's what Nehemiah's role was. He not only had to rise to the occasion, he had to help other people rise to the occasion. And Nehemiah responded to the official letters he got from the governors of the adjoining provinces. And he could have said, here are copies of my official permissions from the emperor, and says I can do this. But his first argument was, the God of heaven will make us prosper. And we, his servants, will arise and build. But you have no place in this project. You have no right to tell us we cannot build. And you really have no part in the process. This wasn't the first time that the people of God had faced problems. Back when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt in the Exodus, 12 spies had gone into Palestine. They had come back with a message, two messages. 10 of them said, the people of the land are too big. We cannot overcome the obstacles we're facing. They had faced it, and they had decided to run. The other two, whose names we remember, Joshua and Caleb, it said, if the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them. The Lord is with us. Do not fear them. We're going to eat them up, is what Caleb and Joshua told the people. And so Nehemiah builds on the message of Caleb and Joshua, because this is another crisis moment for the people of God. And he reminds his people that they will have to count the cost. Jesus, in Luke chapter 9 and again in Luke chapter 14, stresses the importance of counting the cost as a disciple of Jesus and knowing what God calls you to do as an individual Christian. Encourage your allies. Nehemiah was all about that, letting the people of Jerusalem know that now there were people that wanted them to succeed, that wanted them to go forward, that wanted them to hope. So we, too, realize that we have brothers and sisters to stand with us against evil, that when we are tempted, when we are discouraged, that we can go to one another and help each other stand up and stand firm. And that when we see a challenge in front of us as a congregation, that we can work together to meet that challenge. Because we remember the source of our strength. We remember that if God be for us, who can be against us? John Newton, who also wrote Amazing Grace, wrote another song. Glorious things of thee are spoken. And in one of the verses of this song, it says, Zion, sense of Zion city. Savior, sense of Zion city, I through grace a member am. Let the world deride or pity. I will glory in your name. Fading is the worldling's treasure, all his boasted pomp and show. Solid joys and lasting treasure, none but Zion's children know. As Christians, we, in a figurative sense, are citizens of Zion City. We are the ones that, though the world deride or pity, though we question our values, we can take confidence in the love of our God. And we can analyze the need that is in our community, that realize the need of the 70,000 and more people that live in this county to hear the gospel of Christ. we can count the cost that it takes from us as a group of people, as individuals, to begin to build a bulwark for Jesus in our community. Last Sunday, a group of about 20 people met after our service to talk about building a youth ministry for this congregation, rebuilding a wall. People went out to Fort Leavenworth on Prayer Day and invited hundreds of people to come to worship here. We give time, we give ourselves, and we give our resources. Because we identify our obstacles, what stands against us in accomplishing our goals, and we also identify the resources that we have. And that we remember that among those resources is the source of our strength. God who works in us through Jesus Christ. Because God has made Jesus to be the head of His church. And we are His church. The fullness of Him who fills all in all, according to Ephesians chapter 1, verse 23. So this morning, have you counted the cost of what it means for you to be a Christian, a follower of Jesus? Have you placed allegiance to God and to Christ by saying, I believe that Jesus is the Son of the living God. I'm going to listen to what He said. And I'm going to live for Him. I'm going to obey Him. Today I'm going to confess that I believe that Jesus is the Christ. I'm going to be baptized for the forgiveness of my sins. Are you ready to rebuild for God? If we're going to succeed as individual Christians in living a life that will result in one day God saying to us, saying to you and saying to me, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of my Lord. If we as a congregation are going to serve with the kind of vigor and enthusiasm that will bring our friends and our neighbors and our relatives back to Jesus, we're going to have to answer this question, are we ready to rebuild for God? Because in this city there are still many people who need our Lord. Who need for us to say, individually and as a group, that we care for them. And not only we care, but God cares. And to show them a light and a way. So today, if you're ready to rebuild for God, if you're ready to confess your love for Jesus, come now while we stand and we sing.